types of interest groups, and the most common type of interest groups, which would be groups that represent business interests. One thing I wanted to make clear is this pie chart tells you, which types of interest groups are dominant, as into which types of interests have the most groups. In other words, representing the interest. That doesn't necessarily mean the most people, right, or members of those groups. So, for instance, something like the AARP, right, which is the largest interest group that represents retired persons, would be in this sort of public interest group, and that has the largest number of members of any interest group in the United States. So just be aware that even though some of these interests may seem like they're underrepresented, that doesn't mean that some of the groups that belong in these smaller slices of the pie don't have a lot of power or aren't substantial in size. So I just wanted to make that clarification. Okay, so we have interest groups. We also have social movements as another sort of entity in group politics. And social movements are really just a constellation of interest groups, because generally once a social movement kind of coalesces, groups will form inside it that are interest groups. But what distinguishes social movements from sort of more traditional interest groups is a couple of things. One, the use of popular participation. So kind of people are participating in the movement that may not even belong to specific organizations that populate a movement. And generally also this participation that's going to have sort of a larger popular base often will be engaged in activities that won't be specifically related to what a particular organization or group in the movement is trying to do. So something like the civil rights movement, the animal rights movement, things like these, the women's movement and so forth, represent not only a constellation of organizations, but also people who are active, right, pursuing those goals inside the movement. Generally, social movements represent marginalized populations or groups. So people who feel excluded from the political process. Now, sometimes, most of the time, well, I shouldn't say most of the time, but quite often, these are marginalized populations. So African Americans, the civil rights movement, women in the women's movement, and so forth. But sometimes social movements can actually be populated by people who are not marginalized based on their identity, but feel like their interests are excluded from the political process. So what would be a really good example of a currently active, significant social movement where the members of the movement are not necessarily themselves part of a marginalized population, but they feel their views are marginalized? What? Well, the gay rights movement is interesting because I would say that is a marginalized population, even though there are many very successful people, but the political rights of those individuals are fairly marginalized. Less so now, but certainly in the 70s, 80s, 90s, when the movement kind of formed in the 70s and so forth, they were a highly marginalized population. What's the big kind of political social movement of the moment?
The Tea Party.
The Tea Party would be a great example of a social movement. The Tea Party is a social movement. Has many constituent organizations, but also a large popular base of people who are sort of participating, right, in the movement. Now, the Tea Party doesn't really represent a marginalized population in the sense that the individuals don't have their political rights or are not economically successful, but they feel their viewpoint, right, has been excluded from the political process. So ideas like fiscal responsibility and stuff, which is no longer, respected in Washington.
If you explain the Tea Party, I don't even.
The Tea Party largely formed when we're going to talk in a minute about the importance of entrepreneurs to interest groups and social movements, so individuals who sort of organize activity. But the Tea Party was sparked basically when a couple of individuals got together to try and encourage people to protest, basically government spending for the most part, and basically got people to send tea bags to members of Congress, or to have protests using tea bags, and so that's where the Tea Party came from. Obviously capitalizing on the Boston Tea Party and the ideas of taxation and government spending and no representation and things like that. From there, the Tea Party has kind of grown, and so that, I believe that was in 2009. The Tea Party kind of got its start. And as is often typical with social movements, it's not entirely clear exactly what the Tea Party stands for, because you have a lot of different organizations, right, that are kind of within the Tea Party, and they don't all agree. For the most part, the main Tea Party idea is limited government, right? To pursue for fiscal responsibility and limited government, basically. And that's the main plank. The degree to which the Tea Party also stands for more traditional conservative values, that's something that's, I think, harshly divisive within the so-called Tea Party movement, because initially the Tea Party drew a lot of libertarians and even a lot of Democrats, people on the left also, who were sort of attracted to some of the tenets of the Tea Party. And now these people are all trying to sort of uncomfortably be housed together. Post 2010, when the Tea Party was really successful with people like Sarah Palin, kind of after the unsuccessful run for the White House, she became Glenn Beck, other big conservative figures. That kind of pushed the Tea Party more to the right, in the sense of adding sort of social conservatism into the Tea Party. Nobody really knows what's going to happen now, right, going forward, whether the Tea Party will continue to be sort of a successful social movement, given obviously the lack of success in 2012 for the elections.
Is it actually making a difference? I mean, is it just kind of, here's our voice, you know what I mean?
Well, the Tea Party was very influential in the 2010 elections. I mean, the Republicans, won a substantial, won control of the House, and they didn't take the Senate, but, they upped their representation in the Senate, and that was largely driven by Tea Party enthusiasm. So, but the problem with social movements is because they're made up of constituent organizations, those organizations can often be at odds. They often have coordination problems, right? And so it's difficult for movements to sustain themselves and continue, and you also don't know whether people's sort of initial upset about the election of President Obama, about the healthcare issue and so forth, whether or not people have sort of lost interest, right, in that, or become resigned to it. And so if you lose your popular mass base kind of support. So we'll see what happens. But the Tea Party would probably be one of the the newest social movement that we see in American politics, and they've had a lot of success. So here's just kind of a general, you have individuals with a common interest, whether it be, civil rights issues for the civil rights movement, the women's movement, gay rights movement, all share an interest in, fighting for civil rights for their members. It could be something like the animal rights movement or the peace movement, or, there was in the 70s a big anti-nuclear power movement. So people who share a common interest. They find other people with those interests and they start organizing into groups. So, you know, the protest of the Vietnam War, so the anti-war movement in the 70s, late 60s and 70s, would be a lot of student groups on campus, like SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, and so forth. So people who are like-minded will start to form groups, right? And then those groups will begin to become active. So in the case of the civil rights movement, the groups start to, once they become active, they start to coordinate. For instance, the sit-ins at lunch counters and so forth in the South, like you would have college students who had formed groups on their campus, African American college students, and they just on their own decided to go into the drugstores like Woolworths and sit in at the lunch counter, basically to defy the whites only, right, policy. And so that was their own spontaneous idea, right, of a way to protest in favor, you know, for their civil rights. People like Martin Luther King, church leaders and others noticed what they were doing, right, and began to try and coordinate and communicate with those student groups, right? So in order to coordinate action to be more productive. And so that's kind of how social movements work. You have different organizations form, they start to be active, and then those groups find each other and start coordinating their action, and that forms a movement. Eventually, if a movement is widespread or successful, then those organizations that have formed become, you know, mainstream Washington lobby organizations, right? So things like the NAACP, the Rainbow Coalition, MALDEF, NOW, Human Rights Campaign, right? These are all major interest groups, essentially, that promote the interests of these various different social movements, right? And so they're very established in Washington, mainstream. Okay. The problem interest groups and social movements have is that they're in the business of producing public goods. So what's a public good?
Well, that everyone can share.
Right, so if you're producing a public good, what's your biggest problem? Free riders, right? So if you're producing a public good, that means everybody can partake. So when the Civil Rights Movement, for instance, you know, gets their landmark piece of legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965, that's benefiting all African American voters, right? The Voting Rights Act of 1965, whether they participated in the social movement or joined one of the civil rights, you know, interest groups that made up, right, part of the civil rights. So you get to enjoy that benefit. If, you know, a group is fighting for, say, the Tea Party is fighting to reduce tax rates, right? Then everybody gets lower taxes, right? Whether or not they contributed to the efforts of the movement. So, one thing interest groups and social movements have to deal with is the free rider problem, because free riders are enjoying the benefits without helping with the costs. So how do you produce these public goods when not everybody is contributing? And the other problem is they also face coordination problems. The groups that are generally most successful are ones that either are creating public goods as a byproduct of other activities that they're engaged in, so a byproduct of their initial purpose So labor unions, for instance, labor unions exist to collectively bargain on behalf of their union members, but they often create public goods for other workers, right? So, the minimum wage, right? That is a tremendous benefit to all workers, whether they belong to a union or not, whether or not they had contributed. But those labor organizations were also working just to help get better contracts, right, for their members. And as a byproduct, they also created a public good, like the creation of the minimum wage, or a public good like safe factories, right? And those benefit their own workers, but they might also benefit consumers, right? Less pollution in a factory or better goods being produced in a safer factory, right? And so that's a byproduct. So the underlying purpose, though, of the organization is to serve the members that are contributing to the organization. And if they produce public goods as a byproduct, so be it, right? The other kinds of successful organizations are organizations that have figured out how to curb free riding. In other words, figured out how to produce public goods while also getting people to join in the costs. And we're going to talk more about ways to curb free riding in a second. The biggest way to curb free riding is to offer selective incentives. Do any of you belong to an interest group of any type? Any of you ever contributed towards an interest group? Made a donation to like public radio or television or something like that?
It'd be like signing like a petition, like the internet thing about how we don't want government to control our internet. Is that considered?
Yeah, well, that would be part of like putting that kind of political participation. You're at least contributing to, right, the lobbying of the public officials. A lot of you guys are still young, so you haven't had a lot of income to toss around. But anytime you do something where somebody's offering you a T-shirt or a mug, right? So, like, if you donate to public radio, then usually you'll get a T-shirt or a mug in exchange, or a bag or whatever. That's an incentive, right? A selective incentive. Only you have to contribute, right, to the production of the public good. So in public radio, right, public radio is the good. Whether you contribute to NPR or not, you get to listen to their broadcasts, right? So why would anybody contribute? Why does anybody contribute to public television? Right? You can watch Sesame Street whether you contribute or not, right? So why do people do it? Well, because you might feel a moral obligation, right? But a lot of times you do it because, hey, you want the money. I noticed when I donated to Iowa Public Radio this year, you could actually check a box that says, like, because if you gave a certain gift, you could choose a mug, and if you gave more, you got T-shirts. If you gave more, you got like a really nice bag, like messenger bag and everything. And there was a little box you could check underneath that says, no, I don't want my free gift. I want my entire donation, right, to be contributed for Public Radio. I wanted the mug. So, but I was responding, right, to the selective incentive. But the little box existed because that's basically public radio telling you, we have to use some of your donation, right, to purchase the incentive, right? And so, what do you get? A magazine, right? Magazines are a popular form of selective incentive. Insurance, like different organizations. If you donate, like AARP, you can get deals to buy into AAA, deals to buy insurance, right? Those are important incentives to get people to contribute. rely on contributions from special donors. And so these are generally people that are willing to contribute even though they won't necessarily benefit, or they won't benefit selectively. So in other words, they're giving a lot of money, but they don't derive any special benefit, right? So, these are people willing to bear extra cost, essentially. So wealthy people who make large donations, right, to interest groups. A lot of businesses will make special donations, right, even to interest groups they don't stand to benefit from. The gay marriage movement got support and donations from lots of businesses where there's no benefit necessarily that's going to bear directly other than a publicity benefit, right?
So like, when you donate money for like cancer research and stuff like that, are those interest groups too, or is that something different?
There's a fine line between a charity and an interest group, because a lot of charities are also interest groups because they're pursuing, right, lobbying on behalf. So like if you're donating to the American Cancer Society, right, for instance, that's a charitable organization, but it's also an interest group because they go to Congress and lobby, right, in interest of reducing cancer rates, getting more services for people with cancer, spending money on cancer research. So a lot of what you think of as a charity, it is a charity, but it's also an interest group. And so they also rely on the same thing, rely on special donors, use selective incentives, get your American Cancer Society pin or t-shirt, the Susan Komen for the Cure, get your pink t-shirt, and all that kind of stuff, right? So those are selective incentives. Interest groups and social movements can also be successful when they have entrepreneurs they can rely on. Entrepreneurs are people with talent who are willing to put in effort to help get a group or a movement off the ground. So somebody like Martin Luther King would be an example of an entrepreneur. This is somebody who saw an opportunity to promote civil rights and strategically pursued that opportunity and had special skills and ability to be successful, right? And so movements will not succeed and get off the ground, especially when they represent marginalized interests or populations, unless they have talented entrepreneurs who are willing to promote the group or the movement. And so generally you need to have people who can successfully mobilize, right, an organization or individuals. So entrepreneurs are important. Social movements, and even just sort of interest group communities in particular, have to coordinate. So this can happen whether you have a social movement or just a set of interest groups who pursue the same interests. So like breast cancer research and awareness. The Komen Foundation is the 1,000-pound gorilla, right, in that interest group, selection. So basically, in order to succeed in that field, you have to be able to successfully coexist and coordinate with Komen for the Cure. To the point to which Komen was routinely suing other interest groups in the breast cancer field to protect the ribbon. Other groups couldn't use the pink ribbon and things like that because they considered that their brand, right? And so those create coordination problems, right? So that's sort of a negative example of understanding how interest groups have to work together. A sort of a more positive example of a coordination problem, in my own studies looking at the formation of the early civil rights movement, so sort of during the sort of pre-World War I, World War I period, was when the National Urban League and the NAACP formed. And they both formed basically around 1909. They got together, the leaders met, and they said, okay, NAACP, you do essentially voting and civil rights issues like fight lynching and those sorts of things. Urban League, you deal with labor issues. So basically you promote the interests of African American workers. Because if we don't divide up responsibility, then we'll be duplicating each other's work and we won't be able to accomplish as much, right? And so that's common. Interest groups that pop up within a movement or work in the same issue area need to coordinate their activities. Otherwise, they won't accomplish as much as they need to. They also have to work on messaging. Why is it important to work on messaging?
Because if you have the same problem and you're trying to go about it in different ways, you could stall the process of it actually.
Right, and if you have two groups ostensibly working for the same goal, but they have fundamentally different messages, right, about their goal or about why their goal is important, then they could be working, right, at cross purposes. So, think about all of the hullabaloo recently about birth control pills and abortion and how to talk about Planned Parenthood and the new healthcare regulations that include insuring women for birth control, making that coverage mandatory and so forth. Do you present the message of this is a message about sexual freedom, right? Or do you present this as a message of ensuring economic equality and health for women, right? And you heard people in groups talking about those issues both ways, right? How do people in the public respond to those messages? Are those messages, do they resonate with some people and not others? I mean, think for yourself. If somebody comes to you and says that we have to support this policy because it's a matter of personal choice and freedom, right, for women, versus we have to support this because this is about women's health and economic security. Do you feel different based on those two different messages? Certainly for the American public, you have a lot of groups out there saying we got to change, right, the message. This is a big problem that the Republican Party's, right, facing right now, is the question of whether they need to change some of their underlying positions or whether they need to change their message about some of their underlying positions. So when you have a lot of groups working together, right, message is important. You also want to make sure that everybody's on the same page about who you're supposed to lobby. Because remember, the government, there's a lot of different ways, right, to pursue your policy in our government. You can go to any of the three branches, basically. So do you pursue a legal strategy? Do you pursue lobbying inside the executive and the bureaucracy? Do you go to Congress to try and get laws changed? And so groups need to coordinate about where to target their efforts. If, all it takes is to get what you want as a rule change in the bureaucracy, why would you go through the costly effort of trying to get the whole law changed, right? Why not target, or why would you go through the courts and try and get a law declared unconstitutional if all you really need to do is go lobby a particular government agency and the executive and say, just change the rule on how you're applying this. That's probably a lot lower cost, right, involved. And so if groups all targeted that together. Social movements also think about this in broad strategies. Until right about now, the marriage equality, gay rights movement has been targeting lawsuits as a way, and not even at the federal level, but even at the state level, right? And so initially in places like Massachusetts or here in Iowa, they targeted litigation, right? They targeted the courts as the place to put all efforts. More recently, in places like Connecticut and New York, they've switched to legislative strategies because they realize there's opportunities now, right, in legislative bodies in some states, Vermont, so forth. You don't need to use the courts anymore. You can target all of your efforts, right, into state legislatures. Well, groups need to coordinate on that and work together, right, and say, okay, we're all on board with this strategy. And then in 2012, you even see a willingness to go out and even do referenda for propositions, right? Because there's more opportunity there. Okay, are social movements and interest groups successful? Obviously, one way to measure success is, do you get what you want, right? Does Congress change a law in your favor? And so forth. If tax rates go down, is that because of the Tea Party? How would you know, right? So one of the most difficult problems that interest groups and social movements have, or at least not so much that they have, but that the people who study them have, is, of course, an interest group or social movement is always going to claim victory, right, when a policy gets changed in their favor, right? Of course, that's in their interest, right, to look like winners. For political scientists, the question is, well, okay, you claimed victory, but were you really the reason, right, that the policy was changed, or was that just you happened to get lucky, right, that the policy was being changed for another reason and you just happened to be able to benefit from it? So the problem is when a legislator is being lobbied, we don't know whether the lobbying is what made the difference, right? What compounds the problem of not knowing whether or not it was your lobbying that made the difference is that generally interest groups and social movements lobby legislators or bureaucrats that already favor their policy. So, gay rights groups don't spend a lot of time and money trying to lobby Republicans, right, for their cause. They lobby Democrats, right? People who are pursuing tax cuts are not going to start in the, Democrats' offices. They're going to start, right, in the Republican offices. So if you're spending your resources lobbying people who already generally agree with you, then it becomes even harder to measure, right, whether or not it was your lobbying that made the difference.
Isn't that like the point? I mean, I don't understand why they can't claim the victory, because it's they're obviously part of the reason why anything happened because of the annoying buzz in the air. You know what I mean?
Right. Well, think of it this way. For them, it's of course strategically sound, right, to claim the victory. But from the perspective of somebody studying it and trying to really understand what's happening, it's also probably good, even though they should be out there claiming victory, the people who run the organization should probably know, because they want to know whether they're spending their money wisely, right? This money is not an inexhaustible resource. So why throw all your money at lobbying when you know actually it is not really, you're not getting bang for your buck, right? You could spend that money somewhere else where you get better bang for your buck. So internally, it's important for them to know, right, whether or not, how they're spending their money, whether it's useful or not. And so, or whether it's just piling on, to something that was already going to happen. Robert Dahl, who was an influential political theorist and political scientist in the mid-20th century, basically discussed or talked about the idea of pluralism in American politics. And the idea behind pluralism is basically just that American politics is really the conflict of multiple groups who are all trying to lobby government, right? And so essentially you can understand and explain American politics by understanding that it is really just a representation of lots of people, lots of groups and their interests, and no one group dominates American policymaking. Because really it's pluralistic. It's all these groups, right, that are coming in and dominating. The big critique of pluralists, and that spawned like a whole school of political science, basically the pluralists, who understood American politics as the product of competing groups, right, and their policy preferences. The critique of the pluralists, and that was basically, the idea was that was fabulous, right? That's really good because that's what democracy should be all about, right? Is that policy should reflect the interests of all these groups, and isn't it great that no one group, right, always gets their way, that all these groups have to compete, right, for policy. Then that was great and democratic and all of this. The big critique of the pluralists was that, sure, no one group always gets their way, right? But if you look at the groups that are competing, they represent a particular set of interests. And so the famous critique goes, the chorus in the pluralist heaven sings with an upper class accent. So the idea was, yes, there are multiple groups that find their way into politics, but they all represent the haves, essentially. And that it's rare that the have-nots essentially basically find an ear in American politics. And that when the have-nots essentially succeed on policy, maybe with something like the civil rights movement, that's very notable, right? Because the norm in pluralism is that, it's upper class or wealthy interests that are being represented. That obviously takes us back to this, right? To kind of understand. This is pluralism, right? Look at all these groups that are active, right? But think about which interests have the most share of the pie. All right. As far as lobbying is concerned, in order to lobby, you need access, right? You can't effectively lobby a legislator or the executive if they won't grant you access. So, two types of groups tend to have success in getting access to legislators. Groups that represent the legislator's constituents, right? So I represent your voters. So groups that represent just broad national issues or interests tend to not be as successful as groups that say, hey, I represent people in your actual district, right? Your own constituents. They tend to get more access. Access can also be bought. So if an interest group contributes to the member's campaign, they're more likely to get access. The people who get the most access are people that not only contribute to campaigns, but also represent, right, constituents. So that's the electoral connection. You can you grease the wheels with money, but you also deliver votes. That will get you access. If you can't do either one, then chances are you're not going to be granted access. This is where there isn't a lot of evidence, and political scientists have studied this, there isn't a lot of examples of sort of the quid pro quo, like the direct exchange of give me money and I will do exactly what you tell me to do. Where the influence of money is crystal clear is that it takes money to get in the door. Now, once you're in the door, there isn't necessarily a guarantee you'll get what you want. But it's basically a pay-to-play system in Congress.
I was just gonna say, most lobbyists are former legislators, aren't they? Like ones that have all the ties with the actual legislators.
Well, right, and we'll, talk about that more in a second. So yes, it's quite common, and we're going to go to opensecrets.org, which is a website that kind of tracks money in politics, and that's the so-called revolving door problem, right? Which is people who are either legislators or who work in government, like or work on Capitol Hill, then become lobbyists, right? And so, a lot of people view that as corrupt, or at least unethical in the sense because you have this special influence, right? But those people are expensive.
Well, I would say, because I worked at the Capitol for this last session, and all of the lobbyists I met were former legislators, and they were like veterans.
Yeah, well, they know the
They were
system.
good people. They just
Yeah, they know the system, and it's easier, right, for them to talk to, right, the other legislators
Yeah,
because
they were buddies.
Yeah, they're buddies. They know the system. It's very, cozy, right? And so interest groups are paying, right, for that because they want the person who is buddy-buddy, is golf partners with, the legislators. Two different types of lobbying or influencing public officials. Inside lobbying is making direct contact with policymakers, giving them money, meeting with them, right? The traditional form of lobbying, right? Which is direct contact. Outside lobbying is coming essentially from the outside, right? So mobilizing people outside the legislature to put pressure on it. Letter writing campaigns, right? Petitions, protests, right? Million-man marches, right, on the Capitol. That's outside lobbying. Advertising and public relations expenses. What's the purpose of advertising? Who are you trying to reach when you're advertising? You're trying to reach people, but are you trying to reach the people that can actually change policy, or are you trying to reach somebody else?
People with common interest that would want to help.
Right, so what you're trying to reach is the person who would write the letter, right? Or who would show up at a protest or something like that, right? So public relations and advertising campaigns are about mobilizing people on the outside to put pressure, right, on people on the inside. Outside lobbying is often what social movements do because social movements usually represent marginalized populations. And what do marginalized populations not have a lot of? Influence. You don't have access. You don't have a lot of money. You don't have a lot of access. If you've never even been allowed to vote, right? You're not going to be inside Washington, right? You're not going to have any way of directly communicating with those legislators. And you certainly, if you can't even vote, you can't deliver constituents, right? So why should those people even listen to you, right? Because you can't provide them with money and you can't provide them with votes, right? So why should you be of any interest? So that's important. So you're left with outside lobbying, which generally is for the most part less expensive in a sense than inside lobbying. It's at least something that's open to people who don't have a lot of insider, right, access. Outside lobbying is also really important for marginalized groups that may make up small segments of it. So the gay rights movement, for instance, right? Outside lobbying is very important to them. Why?
Because they want to change the attitudes of the general public, not just legislators?
Right, and why do they have to change the attitudes of the general public? Do gay people make up a substantial voting population? No, well, it's a small minority of the population, right? So in order, there's two things that legislators want that you need, and if you can deliver both, great, but you've got to deliver one or the other. You have to deliver money or votes, right? So homosexuals are not going to be able to deliver enough votes in and of themselves, right, to spark the interest of legislators. So whose votes do they have to deliver?
If they have people support, then you have the pressure.
Right, and how do you build the support of other people? You engage in outside lobbying techniques, right? And so that's important. The reason why the gay rights movement has been successful is partly because of outside lobbying, but also because they also have a very successful slice of the population who can also deliver a lot of money, right? So that movement has been relatively successful partly because part of the community is very successful and willing to serve as special donors, right? So the idea we talked about before of the special donor, which is somebody who may not benefit or won't benefit, is willing to basically donate out of proportion to the benefit, right, they would receive. So they've been fortunate to be able to have a lot of special donors, but also effectively have an outside lobbying, campaign. Civil rights movement was similar. There were some very successful white patrons of the civil rights movement. So there were some very wealthy and influential members of like the NAACP, for instance, and the Urban League that brought some money into the early civil rights movement, but largely that was a movement that had to rely on outside lobbying, right, protests and so forth, in order to be successful. Obviously, when thinking about interest groups, we have to think about campaign financing. We're going to talk more about campaign financing when we study elections directly, but you have to talk about it when talking about interest groups because obviously interest groups are going to be purchasing their access, right? Their lobbying access through campaign donations. So I want to just take a quick look at OpenSecrets.org, which we'll be looking at again when we study campaigns and elections after the break. But if you look on this website, go up here to Influence and Lobbying. This gives you numbers that have been compiled. So these are totals. Summary of political giving back to 1990. Here are interest group totals of donations for 2011 to 2012. So, finance, insurance, and real estate. Interest groups that fall into that category have given, in the year 2011-2012, $535 million in campaign donations, and you can see that Republicans garner a large share of that. The discrepancy there in the number will be because Open Secrets also classifies to outside groups like PACs and super PACs, right? So these outside groups that aren't Republicans or Democrats but advertise, right, in elections. Anything? Guys, let's see who the big donors are. Goldman Sachs. What a shock. So look at how much they're investing in essentially purchasing access, right, to legislators or to the executive.
How many lobbyists do they employ then?
I don't know off the top of my head, but
Like a
many,
figure?
you know, a lot. So some of this is, this is not even lobby costs. This is donations, right, to candidates. Their expenses for lobbying would be separate from this, like the salaries basically they were paying, right, for the people to go lobby for them. So green is outside groups like PACs, and Republicans is red, and blue means donations to Democrats. Then if we look at, so let's look at lawyers and lobbyists. Lobbyists actually lobby Congress. And why do you suppose lobbyists are lobbying Congress? What are they lobbying for? What do you think they're lobbying for? Aside from doing their day job lobbying, what are they lobbying for?
Build connection.
Well, they may be building connections for themselves, but you know, there's all kinds of laws you can pass about disclosure rules, right? For like how to disclose. There's also all kinds of laws you can pass prohibiting the revolving door, which allows people that basically to do that would be you can't lobby an institution that you once served in. Well, that's obviously against the interests, right, of people who are lobbyists. So it's always interesting to think about why are lobbyists need their own institutions. But this kind of gives you lawyers, these big firms are lobbying. And it's kind of interesting because you can see where the finance and real estate is heavily Republican in orientation as far as who they're buying access to. This comes into, you lobby the people that are already supportive, right, of your own interests. Lawyers tend to support Democrats because Democrats are generally more favorable. So things like tort reform, right, which cuts down on the money that lawyers can earn. And generally Republicans are in favor of tort reform. So lawyers tend to donate to Democrats. So you can see that, a lot of big money. Let's see. Here's your big telecoms and cable companies.
What exactly is pro-Israel?
That is one of the single issue groups. Or do they have a separate category?
It's
for it?
under top industries giving to all members of Congress. It's under interest groups also.
Yeah, well, obviously the lobby in favor of Israel is very powerful. And so a lot of Jews especially spend a lot of money on pro-Israel lobbying. Let's look at, we look under lobbying.
Has there always been like a pro-Israel thing?
Oh yeah, so that's been a substantial a very active community.
Oh, it's right above beer, wine, and liquor.
So, yeah, casinos and alcohol and tobacco always spend big. They want to get rid of those sin taxes. They want to make sure that it's as cheap as possible for people to buy their goods. This will tell you lobbying, number of lobbyists, total lobbying spending. Here, this is, look at how much it's grown. Pretty impressive. We can look at top spenders. So, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce spent almost $1 billion. Who do the U.S. Chamber of Commerce represent?
Small businesses.
Small businesses, right? They're represented by the Chamber of Commerce. So this would be lobbying basically to reduce onerous regulations, that sort of thing. It would be the kind of fight any increase in the minimum wage. Those kinds of things would be pursued by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Then we jump way down, right, in the amount. General Electric, not surprisingly, the AMA is highly active right now. Why is the AMA highly active right now? They're always active, but why would they be particularly near the top of late?
Baby boomers retiring? No.
Well, that's good for their bottom line. But what issue has the American Medical Association animated right now? Obamacare, right? So a major change to the healthcare system. So they're out. A hospital association also, obviously. So you can see they're active. Let's see if they've got.
I assume that the numbers from 12 are just not completely in yet, and that's why it's
Yeah,
low.
no, this will be updated as the numbers
Okay.
come in.
So when they are electing people, like the parties, when they elect a person to run for president, do they ever look at like who is like giving money to these people? Like, because I see a lot of supporters for like Ron Paul. Like a lot of them give money for Ron Paul as a Republican.
Yeah, well, this exists
Whatever.
because you guys choose who runs for these offices, right? And because we have primaries now, so we don't choose in the smoke-filled room anymore. Voters choose, right? Regular party members choose who is going to, run for office. And so something like Open Secrets has been created in order to provide information. So it's a good place to go if you're thinking about, where is the money coming from for this person I'm interested in supporting?
I guess I just don't understand how they compile these numbers. Like, do they go through all of these companies' financials?
Because there's generally disclosure requirements by law.
Okay.
And so you have to disclose your campaign donations, you have to disclose your lobbying expenses. And so Open Secrets goes through and compiles those public filings, basically, that have to be made.
So lobbying expenses can include just gifts, meals, advertisements, anything that gets your person in the door to meet with somebody and gets your message out?
Yeah, I would have to read the fine print on what's going into this, but my understanding would be this is like total lobbying
Okay.
expenses.
Both inside and out. Okay.
Let's see. Contributions. Here we see some people.
Do lobbyists have like a union then or something?
Well, they don't have a union, but
They have something.
they'll meet in various organizations, right, to talk about what they want to do. Here is industries. Here's the public interest groups, essentially would be under ideology and other issues. And so if you want to know, like, where the money is going as far as public interest groups are concerned, the issues that are getting money out